This morning, a sheriff with 37 years in law enforcement stood behind a podium wearing a pink ribbon and told a room full of reporters something he said he had never had to say before in his entire career. Behind him stood dozens of his own deputies and investigators, almost all of them wearing pink as well. Pink was Javeayah's favorite color. It was also, by this point, the only thing left for a community to hold on to. If you're new to this case, here's what you need to know before we go further. Javeayah Harris was 4 years old, from Aiken, South Carolina. She was reported missing on the evening of June 30th, 2026. What followed was one of the largest search operations Aiken County has ever mounted. Thousands of acres searched, helicopters, drones, cadaver dogs, hundreds of volunteers. 4 days later, investigators announced they believed Javeayah had actually been dead for at least a month before that search ever began, and that her parents, 23-year-old Javeayah Harris and 22-year-old Michelle Herring, had been arrested and charged with homicide by child abuse. According to the warrants released at the time, both parents admitted involvement during questioning. As of this recording, that case has taken another devastating turn, and it's why we're back with an update today. For those who have followed every step of this, you already know how strange and disjointed this investigation has felt from the outside. It began as a straightforward missing child search, one that pulled in the FBI, state police, and hundreds of volunteers combing more than 3,000 acres around Hillsborough Street. Then, almost overnight, it became something else entirely. A homicide investigation with 2 confessed suspects already living under the same roof as the child they were searching for. Then it split again into 2 active scenes at once. Investigators sifting through the family's own backyard on one side of the state, while dive teams and drone units worked a reservoir 2 hours away on the other. Each phase of this case has demanded the public reconcile a version of events with the one that came before it. Today's press conference is the latest and, by the sheriff's own account, the most difficult of those reconciliations yet. Before we get into what Sheriff Marty Sawyer revealed this morning, if you're following this investigation, this is the moment to subscribe to True Crime Vault and turn on notifications. This case is moving fast, and we are covering every development as it happens, with the same commitment to accuracy and respect that we bring to every case on this channel. If you want to be here for whatever comes next, hit that subscribe button and like this video so more people can follow this story with us. Now let's get into what changed this morning. At 10:30 a.m. Today, Sheriff Sawyer held a press conference at the Aiken County Sheriff's Office to provide what he called an update on the death of 4-year-old Javeayah Harris. He opened by thanking the community, thanking the law enforcement agencies who had worked alongside his office, and acknowledging how difficult the past week had been for everyone involved. Then he said something that set the tone for everything that followed. He said there were harsh words he personally wanted to use to describe the 2 people responsible for what happened to Javeayah, but that he had chosen not to say them publicly in order to protect the integrity of the ongoing case. What he did say was this: he would no longer refer to Javeayah Harris and Michelle Herring as Javeayah's mother and father. In his words, they don't deserve that title. That's not a line a career law enforcement officer says lightly, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before moving into the details, because it tells you something about what investigators have uncovered since our last update. Sawyer described this as one of the most difficult, deeply disturbing, and emotionally taxing investigations his office has ever worked. He said it plainly: he was sickened by what this investigation uncovered. Here's what we now know. Investigators recovered some of Javeayah's remains from a body of water in Fairfield County known as Cedar Creek Reservoir, also referred to locally as Stumpy Pond, the same reservoir that search crews had been working for close to a week using boats, dive teams, and drones. Those remains were sent to the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division for DNA analysis. According to Sheriff Sawyer, the results confirm the remains are consistent with being the biological child of Javeayah Harris and Michelle Herring. In plain terms, after 5 days of searching, then a week of silence, then another week of searching in a different county entirely, Javeayah has been found. Not in the way anyone prayed for, but found. What Sawyer said next is the part of this update that reframes the entire case. Based on forensic evidence, statements, and analysis gathered during the investigation, He said extensive and deliberate efforts were made to destroy and conceal evidence following Javeayah's death. He stated that corrosive chemicals and other tools were used to accelerate the destruction of her remains, and that once that process was carried out, what remained was placed into the reservoir where searchers eventually found it. We're not going to dwell further on the mechanics of that beyond what the sheriff himself disclosed publicly, because the details don't need to be more graphic than the facts already are to convey how serious this is. What matters for understanding this case is what that action means from an investigative standpoint, and we'll get to that. Sawyer said something that, coming from a man with nearly 4 decades in this line of work, lands harder than almost anything else said this morning. In my 37 years in law enforcement, he said, I have never, ever heard of anything so horrific. He added that as a direct result of what was done to conceal and destroy evidence, it's unlikely that the rest of Javeayah's remains will ever be recovered. He said the department had hoped and prayed to bring her home fully, but that based on what the investigation has now revealed, that outcome simply isn't possible. As a result of these findings, both Javeayah Harris and Marty Herring now face an additional charge: destruction and desecration of human remains. That charge sits on top of the homicide by child abuse charges both were already facing, and on top of the false police report charge Herring was separately charged with in connection with the original 911 call. Sawyer noted that further charges remain possible as the investigation continues. Let's talk about what that added charge actually means for this case, because it changes more than just the paperwork. Up to this point, the central evidence tying both parents to Javeayah's death was their own statements to investigators, the confessions referenced in the original arrest warrants. Confessions carry real legal weight, but they can also be challenged in court. Defense attorneys can question how a statement was obtained, whether it was voluntary, whether it was accurately recorded. Physical forensic evidence is a different category entirely. It doesn't rely on what someone says happened. It exists independently, and once DNA testing confirms those remains belong to Javeayah, that becomes something no defense strategy can argue away. That's part of what makes the destruction and desecration allegation so significant from an investigative standpoint, separate from how disturbing it is on a human level. If the actions described by the sheriff were, as investigators believe, an attempt to eliminate physical evidence that could confirm what happened, that attempt did not fully succeed. Some remains were still recovered. DNA still confirmed her identity. Whatever was done to try to make sure nothing could be proven beyond the parents' own words has now, in part, failed. And it's failed in a way that adds an entirely separate criminal charge on top of everything else this case already carried. There's a broader point here about how cases like this typically move through the legal system, and it's worth explaining plainly, because it changes how the coming months are likely to unfold. Prosecutors building a homicide case generally want more than a confession standing alone, precisely because confessions can be challenged on procedural grounds, however credible they may appear to investigators or to the public. What prosecutors want, whenever possible, is corroboration, evidence that exists independently of anything a suspect said in an interview room. A recovered body with DNA confirmation is about as strong a piece of independent corroboration as a case like this can produce. It doesn't depend on memory, phrasing, or the conditions under which a statement was taken. It exists on its own. That's likely to shape how the Second Circuit Solicitor's Office approaches this case going forward. And it's also likely part of why investigators spent as long as they did working that reservoir before making today's announcement, rather than relying solely on the warrants issued earlier this month. It's worth being precise here about where the legal process currently stands, because that hasn't changed today, even though the emotional weight of this case clearly has. Both Javeayah Harris and Marty Herring remain in custody at the Aiken County Detention Center without bond. Both are formally charged, and under the law, both remain presumed innocent until a court determines otherwise. Homicide by child abuse in South Carolina carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years and a maximum of life imprisonment. A magistrate previously noted that a charge of this severity is outside a magistrate's authority to set bond on, which is why that decision has been deferred to a circuit court judge. Their next scheduled court appearance remains set for September 18th. That date is not a trial. It's expected to be an early procedural hearing, the point at which attorneys are formally involved and the case begins its longer path through the court system. A trial in a case this complex, involving multiple charges and forensic evidence still being processed, could realistically be well over a year away. Between now and September, there's a substantial amount of work that has to happen on both sides before anyone sets foot in a courtroom for a formal hearing. Prosecutors will need to compile everything gathered so far into a coherent case file: the original warrants, the forensic results from the reservoir, whatever evidence was collected during the 2 searches of the family home, and the full, unedited versions of both parents' statements to investigators, not just the summaries referenced in the initial warrants. Defense attorneys, once formally retained or appointed, will have the right to review all of that material, challenge how it was gathered, and potentially file motions related to how the confessions were obtained. None of that is unusual in a case this serious. It's simply the process working as it's designed to, even when the underlying facts are as difficult as they are here. It also means that much of what the public wants most right now, a clear account of exactly what happened and why, may not become fully available until well into that process, if it becomes available in full at all before a trial. There is also the practical matter of sentencing exposure, which is worth explaining without overstating what's actually been decided. If both parents are ultimately convicted on the charges they currently face, homicide by child abuse, destruction and desecration of human remains, and in Herring's case, filing a false police report, the combined sentencing range extends up to life imprisonment, potentially with additional years added depending on how a judge chooses to structure any sentence beyond the primary charge. None of that is guaranteed, and none of it is decided. It's simply the range the law allows for these specific charges, and it underscores why the state has treated this case, from the earliest bond hearing forward, as one of the most serious kinds of prosecution the criminal justice system handles. We want to address something directly here, because it's the question almost everyone watching this update is asking, even if they haven't said it out loud. Why would 2 people go this far? If the original allegation was that Javeayah's death resulted from an untreated injury and weeks of silence, what does it mean that, according to investigators, so much additional effort went into destroying what remained of her afterward? We don't have a confirmed answer to that, and it's important to say clearly that neither we nor the public have been given one. Sheriff Sawyer did not disclose a motive at today's press conference, and when reporters asked directly whether there was one specific incident that led to Javeayah's death, he said he was not able to speak on that. What we can offer is context, not speculation dressed up as fact. People who study cases involving prolonged concealment following a child's death describe a pattern that isn't about hatred toward the child specifically. It's often described as a spiral driven by the fear of exposure. The first decision not to seek help is usually the hardest one to make, and researchers who study these patterns note that with each day that decision goes uncorrected, the perceived cost of finally telling the truth increases, even as the situation continues to deteriorate. Extending that same logic to what happened afterward, the destruction of evidence, according to that same body of research, is sometimes not a single panicked act, but a continuation of exactly the same impulse, taken to its most extreme point. None of that explains everything about this case. It may not even be accurate here, but it's the most honest, responsible answer available right now, and it's more honest than inventing a motive nobody in law enforcement has confirmed. It's also worth resisting the instinct, understandable as it is, to look for something in either parent's background that neatly explains all of this. A single warning sign that, in hindsight, should have made everything obvious. Sometimes that kind of clear signal exists in cases like this one. Often it doesn't, and the discomfort of that absence is part of what makes cases like Javeayah's so hard for a community to metabolize. 2 people who, by the account given during their own bond hearing, held ordinary jobs, paid rent, and lived what looked from the outside like an unremarkable life, are now facing some of the most serious charges South Carolina law allows. That gap between the ordinary and the almost unthinkable is not something a single news update can close, and it's not something this channel is going to pretend to close either. What is not in question, and what several child welfare researchers have pointed out in cases with similar patterns, is how common it is nationally for a child's death at the hands of a parent or caregiver to be the actual cause, even when it isn't always recognized or classified that way. According to data published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, well over 1,000 children lose their lives to a parent or caregiver in the United States every year. And researchers who study this area believe the true number is higher, since some cases without a thorough investigation are recorded differently. That statistic doesn't make this case any less specific or any less devastating. If anything, it's a reminder that what happened to Javeayah, however singular it feels watching it unfold, sits on a continuum that child welfare systems across the country continue to struggle to catch in time. South Carolina in particular has faced sustained public attention in recent years over how child welfare cases are tracked and flagged before they escalate. Child advocacy groups in the state have repeatedly pointed to gaps between agencies, schools, medical providers, and law enforcement as a recurring theme in cases where warning signs existed but were never connected into a single picture until it was too late. We want to be careful here because nothing publicly confirmed in this case indicates a missed report or a prior referral to Child Protective Services regarding Javeayah specifically, and it would be irresponsible to suggest otherwise without evidence. What we can say is that cases like this one tend to reopen that broader conversation regardless of the specific facts, because the underlying question, how does a child fall through every available safety net, is one that extends well beyond any single family or county. Let's step back for a moment from the legal and investigative details, because there's a part of this update that isn't about statutes or forensic timelines at all. It's about the people who have spent the last week and a half showing up for a 4-year-old girl most of them never met. Since the initial announcement on July 4th, a memorial outside the family's home on Hillsborough Street has grown from a small collection of items around the mailbox to something that now stretches across the front lawn. Stuffed animals, balloons, candles, an overwhelming amount of pink, because that was her favorite color, and because a community decided that was the one thing they still had the power to give her. One woman who attended an earlier vigil told a local reporter she found herself in tears every night since the case began, that it touched her in a way she couldn't fully explain. A former first responder who attended described the case as heartbreaking, both as a parent and as someone who has spent years responding to emergencies in that same community, saying she had to call her own adult daughter afterward just to hear her voice. Today, in the hours after the press conference, that same community response continued. A candlelight vigil was scheduled for this evening, with attendees asked to gather before walking together to the memorial outside Javeayah's home. Organizers, largely working without any formal structure, have also planned a second vigil for Friday, this time near Union County, closer to the reservoir where Javeayah's remains were ultimately found, and closer to an area both parents had lived in before moving to Aiken. Attendees at that gathering have been asked to bring a teddy bear instead of a candle. A children's charity event is also being organized in Javeayah's honor later this month. There's something worth naming plainly about what this community has done over the past week and a half, because it stands in such stark contrast to everything else in this case. A local restaurant owner cooked and personally delivered dozens of meals to search crews working 2 hours from home on a holiday most people spend with their own families. Neighbors who had never met this family before June 30th have stood outside their home night after night, not out of curiosity, but because leaving felt like the wrong thing to do. None of it changes what investigators say happened to Javeayah. None of it can. But it's the only part of this story where people had a real choice, and they kept choosing to show up. It's worth pointing out that none of this outpouring was centrally organized by any single church, charity, or civic group. Flyers for vigils have circulated informally online, often without anyone claiming credit for putting them together. People simply arrive, bring what they can, pink balloons, teddy bears, handwritten notes, and stand together for however long it takes to feel like they've done something. At one of the earlier gatherings, attendees described a kind of grief that's hard to categorize, not the grief of losing someone they personally knew, but something adjacent to it, born out of following a child's story closely enough, for long enough, that her absence started to feel personal anyway. That's not unique to this case, but it is worth acknowledging as its own real phenomenon, because it's a large part of why a case in a mid-sized South Carolina county has drawn coverage and public attention well beyond the boundaries of Aiken. There's also a quieter form of support that's emerged around this case that deserves mention. Local businesses have donated water and supplies to search crews. Off-duty officers from neighboring counties have shown up on their own time to help with searches outside their own jurisdictions. School counselors in the area have reportedly fielded questions from children who heard about the case from parents or classmates and didn't know how to process it. None of that makes headlines the way a press conference does, but it's part of the honest, full picture of what a community absorbing news like this actually looks like day to day. Sheriff Sawyer closed his remarks this morning by saying that while today marks an especially painful chapter in this case, it does not mark the end of the investigation. He said his office will continue pursuing every lead and working with the Second Circuit Solicitor's Office to see this case through to trial. He asked the public to keep Javeayah's extended family in their thoughts, along with his own staff and the other law enforcement agencies who have spent the better part of 2 weeks on this case. He also thanked the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and the Fairfield County Sheriff's Office by name, noting that DNR's dive teams in particular had spent hours upon hours working the reservoir before these remains were ever located. When reporters asked whether prosecutors might eventually pursue the death penalty given the severity of these new charges, Sawyer said that decision belongs to the solicitor's office, not to him, and that he didn't want to speak on their behalf. When asked whether extended family members had raised concerns about not seeing Javeayah for an extended period before June 30th, he declined to add anything beyond what his office has already stated, that investigators believe she had been dead for about a month before that 911 call was made. When pressed on whether a single specific incident caused her death, he said only that he wasn't able to answer that question at this time, a response that, more than anything else this morning, underlined how much about this case is still not part of the public record. One reporter asked Sawyer directly about the pink ribbons and ties worn by his staff and about what the vigils happening across the county meant to him personally. His answer was simple and, notably, one of the only moments in the press conference where his voice audibly steadied rather than caught. He said the community had organized around wearing pink because it was Javeayah's favorite color, and that his department wanted to stand with that effort rather than separate from it. He said plainly that everyone in that room cared about her the way the rest of the community did, and that members of his staff planned to attend the vigil scheduled for later this evening. It's a small moment in the broader scope of a press conference covering forensic findings and new felony charges, but it says something about how this particular department has approached this particular case. Not as a file to close, but as a loss they've allowed themselves to feel alongside the people they serve. Sawyer was also asked more than once in different ways to characterize the two people now facing these charges, and each time he redirected the question back to the process. He noted that he had chosen his earlier words carefully and deliberately, that refusing to call Harris and Herring by the titles of mother and father was as far as he was willing to go publicly, specifically because anything further risked compromising a case that still has to be proven in a courtroom, not just in a press conference. It's a distinction worth appreciating, even if it's frustrating for anyone hoping for more detail today. A sheriff's job at this stage isn't to deliver a verdict. It's to gather evidence, refer charges, and let the judicial system carry the rest of the weight from here. Everything Sawyer said this morning, including what he pointedly did not say, reflected that boundary. Here's where things stand as of this recording. Some of Javeayah's remains have been recovered and formally identified through DNA analysis. Investigators believe it's unlikely that the rest of her remains will ever be found, given what they say was done to destroy them. Both parents remain in custody without bond, now facing homicide by child abuse charges, a charge of filing a false police report against Herring specifically, and, as of today, an added charge for both of destruction and desecration of human remains. Their next scheduled court date remains September 18th, and under the law, both are presumed innocent of every charge until a court determines otherwise. The investigation, according to the sheriff's office, remains open, with additional charges still considered possible. There's a broader observation worth making about how this particular sheriff's office has handled this case from the very first day, because it stands out compared to how some high-profile cases are managed publicly. From the initial missing person announcement through today's press conference, Sawyer has consistently drawn a hard line between what his office can confirm and what remains, in his words, part of an ongoing investigation. He has repeatedly declined to speculate about motive. He has repeatedly redirected questions about sentencing or prosecutorial strategy to the appropriate office rather than answering them himself. Even in a moment as emotionally charged as today's announcement, he stopped short of characterizing the parents beyond declining to call them by their titles. That kind of discipline matters in a case this significant because it protects the eventual trial from claims that law enforcement tried the case in the media before a jury ever had the chance to hear it. It's a small kindness to due process in a case that otherwise offers very few places to find one. It's difficult to know exactly how to close an update like this one, because there isn't a version of it that feels complete. A child is gone. Some, but likely not all, of what remains of her has been recovered. The people facing charges in connection with her death have not yet stood trial, and a community that never had the chance to meet a 4-year-old girl who liked Minnie Mouse and held tightly to people's hands crossing the street has spent a week and a half in pink, refusing to let her be reduced to a case file. Before this case became about warrants and reservoirs and destruction charges, it was about a little girl who, by every account from the people who actually knew her, was easy to love. Neighbors described her as cautious in a way that felt almost old for her age, someone who wouldn't step off a curb without holding an adult's hand first. Relatives described her as sharp and talkative, the kind of 4-year-old who could keep pace with a full adult conversation and ask better follow-up questions than some adults do. She liked chasing chickens in the yard. She asked for a few extra minutes outside before dark, the way most small children do, unaware that request would later be repeated word for word in a 911 call made weeks after she was already gone. She was, by all accounts, just a kid. That's the part of this case worth returning to now, after everything else, because it's the part that's easiest to lose in a story this heavy with legal terminology and forensic detail. Whatever this investigation ultimately proves in a courtroom, Javeayah Harris was a person first, not a case number. And the people who are grieving her right now knew that long before any of us did. If you have any information related to this investigation, you're asked to contact the Aiken County Sheriff's Office directly, or to submit evidence through the tip portal the department has made publicly available. Every detail still matters here, particularly as prosecutors begin building toward whatever comes next in September and beyond. This case is not over, not legally and clearly not for the people who loved Javeayah. We'll be here for the next update, whether that's additional charges, a court date, or eventually a trial. If you want to follow this story with us as it continues, make sure you're subscribed. And if this update affected you the way it affected so many people in Aiken this morning, consider sharing it, because cases like this deserve to be followed accurately, not forgotten the moment the headlines move on. There's a particular responsibility that comes with covering a case at this stage, one that's easy to overlook when a story is moving as quickly as this one has. Once the initial shock of a missing child report fades, and once the disbelief of an arrest settles, what's left is a much longer, much quieter process, the kind that unfolds in filing cabinets and courtroom calendars rather than press conferences. Most of the public attention a case like this receives happens in these early dramatic weeks. Far fewer people are still watching by the time a trial actually begins. Sometimes a year or more later, long after the vigils have ended and the memorial has been taken down. That's part of why we're committing to staying with this one. Javeayah deserves more than a headline cycle. She deserves the follow-through. We also want to say clearly, for anyone watching this who is dealing with something similar in their own life, whether as a parent struggling to cope, a relative worried about a child's safety, or someone who suspects a child they know may be in danger, that help exists and reaching out is never the wrong choice. If you suspect a child is being abused or neglected, you can contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4A-CHILD, available 24 hours a day in more than 100 languages. No situation is too uncertain to make that call. The earlier a concern is raised, the more chances a child has. Before you go, we'd like to know what you think justice looks like in a case like this one. Not as a debate, but as something worth sitting with honestly. Let us know in the comments, and if you haven't already, subscribe to True Crime Vault so you don't miss what comes next in this investigation. Rest easy, Javeayah. They found you, and by every indication, this isn't over yet.